I came to surprise my family on Christmas Eve. From the porch, with the snowflakes clinging to my coat and the weight of presents in my arms, I heard my son's voice say, "The best Christmas present would be if she finally died so we can inherit that house." My name is Margaret Ellis. I am 78 years old, and once upon a time I thought my greatest blessing was the son I raised after my husband passed. I worked as a teacher for 40 years, saved every penny, and built a quiet, respectable life. That old stone house, worth more now than I ever dreamed it could be, was supposed to be a sanctuary for generations. I thought it symbolized love and security. Instead, it had become a prize for my own blood to covet like vultures circling a carcass. I didn't drop the gifts. I didn't gasp or cry. I just stood there frozen with the sound of their laughter seeping through the window like a poison. And in that moment, the warmth of Christmas, of family, of belonging, all of it shattered inside me. That night, I didn't knock on the door. I didn't even clear my throat to alert them. I just turned around. My boots crunched in the snow, and I walked back to my car with the presents still in my arms. There, in the silence, I set the brightly wrapped boxes on the passenger seat, their ribbons glowing faintly under the street lamp, and whispered to myself, "So that's what my life is worth to them." The drive home was long, though it was only 15 minutes. Every street I passed was glowing with twinkling lights, children laughing, carolers at a distance. Yet I felt like a ghost, invisible, floating through a world that had warmth and joy for everyone but me. I reached my house, that grand old stone place with ivy along the walls, and I couldn't bring myself to step inside right away. I stood in the driveway looking at it through fresh eyes. For decades, it had been a symbol of safety. Tonight, it was just a reminder of greed. To them, to my son Michael and his wife, it wasn't a home, it was a payday. Inside, I placed the presents under my small living room tree. I didn't unwrap them, didn't tear them apart in anger. I just left them there untouched. Then I sat down on the couch, wrapped myself in my husband's old blanket, and stared into the darkness. My mind replayed every word, every inflection of their laughter. Michael's voice, my boy, the one I cradled when he was sick, the one I worked 2 jobs to send to college, saying that my death would be the best Christmas gift, and her voice, Linda, the daughter-in-law, who always smiled too sweetly, laughing in agreement. I couldn't help but think back to Christmases past. Michael, just a boy, eyes wide with joy over a toy train set, the smell of roasted ham, the sound of him playing the piano while I hummed along, my husband sitting at the head of the table, alive, strong, the heart of the family. All of it felt so far away now, like a dream I had once lived but could no longer touch. I cried then. I don't cry easily anymore. Age makes you tougher. It makes you used to loss. But that night I cried like I hadn't in years. The sobs came out raw, ragged, tearing at me as though they would never end. I buried my face in the blanket, muffling the sound so the empty house wouldn't echo it back at me. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. To hear them wish me gone, as though my entire existence was a burden standing in the way of their comfort. It was as though they had already buried me, and I was only a walking corpse haunting their lives. At some point, I drifted off to sleep on the couch. When I woke, it was morning. Christmas morning. The light was pale and cold, streaming through the curtains. My eyes were swollen from tears, my mouth dry, my heart heavier than it had ever been. I boiled water for tea, though I had no appetite, and sat quietly at the kitchen table. The silence of the house pressed in on me. Normally, I'd expect a call from Michael by now, "Merry Christmas, Mom," but I knew it wouldn't come, not after what I'd heard. For hours I debated. Should I say something? Should I storm over and scream the truth in their faces? Should I disown him right then and there? Or should I pretend I hadn't heard a word? By noon, I decided I couldn't carry this alone. If I kept it inside, it would eat me alive. So I dressed, put on my heaviest coat, and drove back to Michael's house. When I knocked on the door this time, Linda answered. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were calculating, like they always were when she looked at me. "Oh, Margaret, You should have called. Merry Christmas, she said, her voice sweet as syrup. Michael appeared behind her, pretending surprise and delight. Mom, you came after all. We thought you'd want a quiet day. I stepped inside, breathing in the scent of cinnamon and pine. The house looked perfect garlands, stockings, a feast laid out on the table, but to me it was all a stage set. I could still hear their voices from the night before, see the ugliness beneath the decorations. I handed them the gifts, my hands trembling slightly, and they thanked me with smiles that didn't touch their eyes. We sat at the table, plates filled with food I could hardly taste. It was during dessert pecan pie, Michael's favorite, that I finally set my fork down and looked at them both. My voice was calm, steady, almost too quiet. I heard you last night, I said. Every word. Michael's fork froze midway to his mouth. Linda's smile flickered. I came early to surprise you. I stood on the porch and I heard you say the best Christmas present would be if I died, that you could finally have this house. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Michael laughed nervously. Oh, Mom, come on. You misunderstood. We were joking. You know how people talk when they're joking. Linda nodded quickly, too quickly. Of course, it was just a silly joke. We'd never. But I held their eyes. I've been a teacher all my life. I know when a student is lying to me. And I knew in that moment that they weren't joking. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply nodded once, folded my napkin neatly, and rose from the table. Then I suppose, I said softly, the joke is on you. And with that, I walked out of their house, leaving them in stunned silence. As I stepped back into the winter, the pain was still raw, yes, but beneath it a seed had been planted, quiet, steady, unshakable. They thought I was worth more dead than alive. They thought my house was already theirs, but I would make sure that for as long as I lived, they would never get a single penny of it. Those words, my quiet promise, hung in the cold air as I drove home that afternoon, the steering wheel beneath my hands trembling only a little. People think promises like that are loud, forged in fury and fanfare. Mine was not. It was a small, cold thing that settled in my chest and made every decision that came after feel inevitable. Back at my own kitchen table, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat in the chair where I had once helped Michael with his homework, where I had sewed church costume hems, where I had signed report cards. The house around me felt the way an old photograph does. Familiar lines softened by time, colors a little dulled, but still authentic. I turned the cup slowly, watching steam curl into the pale afternoon light, and thought of the way Linda had laughed, too bright, too practiced when she said the words. That night the phone rang. It was Michael. Mom, he said, voice tight, the kind of voice you use when the conversation could tip into blame and you want to keep it polite. I'm sorry. I didn't mean... You told me you wanted me dead, I said simply. I didn't rise to his stumble. I knew the shape of his excuses as well as I knew the town square. It was a joke, he said. A stupid, awful joke. Linda and I were upset about the mortgage and God, Mom, I'm sorry. He tried to force warmth into the words and failed. There are apologies that bind and apologies that loosen. His was the latter. I felt the rope slip from my hands. A joke is sometimes forever, I said. Words have a way of showing us who people are. I know what you said. There was a silence on his end, heavy enough to be felt. Then, like a child caught keeping a secret, he asked, Are you coming by tomorrow? Maybe we can talk? No, I won't be coming over to your house to be treated like a punchline. I heard his intake of breath, the small choke of indignation. But we will on my terms. We did not talk for a week. He called once, twice, and each time my voice stopped him, not with anger, but with a calm I had not felt in years. I kept my cool because Fury makes mistakes. It rushes you into showing your hand. I needed the next moves to be clean, deliberate. Word travels fast in a small town, and by the second week it had reached Mrs. Klein from across the street, and then Mrs. Klein's sister. And soon at church my pew was occupied by whispers. "Did you hear?" they would murmur, leaning in only to soften the scandal with the shield of religiosity. I'd been the woman who brought lemon squares to bake sales, who stitched quilts for newborns. I had been a quiet, respectable fixture. Now the rumor mill chewed on my family the way bees chew on sugar. People looked at Michael differently, and at me I sensed a strange mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Who in their right mind wouldn't change a will after something like that? I did not tell the town the whole truth. I did not parade the venom of their laughter on the front steps. But I also did not pretend nothing had happened. When neighbors came over with casseroles, I accepted them with civility and plateful of manners. "How are you?" they asked. "Are you all right?" I answered the polite part, "Yes, thank you," and left the rest of the sentence to hang in the air where it could warm my bones if it wanted to. People liked tidy narratives. They preferred that their friend Margaret be a wronged, noble victim who forgave and mended bridges. That was not the story I wanted to sign my name to. On a wet Tuesday morning, with the kind of sleet that makes your bones feel slippery, I took the bus downtown and sat in the lawyer's waiting room. I had called ahead a week before and left a message that I needed advice. The receptionist had been brisk and helpful, and that mattered. Small kindnesses matter when your world feels brittle. The lawyer, Mr. Hargreaves, was a lean man with silver hair and the patient look of someone who has read other people's business for a living and learned not to be surprised. He listened. I told him the bare facts, the part I wished I didn't have to tell, how my son and daughter-in-law had said the words, and then I watched his face for the professional flicker that said he knew what came next: wills, trusts, beneficiaries. "You have options," he said, matter-of-factly, and that was a kind of comfort. Options is a polite way of saying you can take steps to protect yourself. He drew diagrams on a pad of paper: living trusts, joint tenancy, payable on death accounts. He explained how wills can be contested, how joint accounts can be a trap, how power of attorney, if given away in trust, can be used against the grantor if one chooses the wrong person. He was gentle but clear. Most people walk into his office thinking the legal language is a kind of latent life burden. For me, it was armor. "Will they suspect?" I asked, feeling a childish fear curl up in my throat. I had been a teacher of children for 40 years. I prided myself on honesty. How could I now sit and plan in silence while their livelihoods, their expectations were being rewired? "People notice changes when it affects them," he said. "But how you do it discreetly, with legal counsel and with clear instructions, matters. If you want them to be surprised, there are ways." His pen scratched a final line. "But, Mrs. Ellis, before we do anything, I need to know what you want the end result to look like." What did I want? The rhetorical question sat heavy. The honest answer had less to do with spite and more to do with justice. I did not want vengeance in the smear your name kind of way. I wanted my dignity restored. I wanted to ensure that the years of scrimping and sacrifice I had given a man who called me mom would not be reduced to a calculation of their mortgage payments. I wanted them to understand that they could not treat people like instruments to be played. "I want them to never get a penny," I said finally. The words surprised me, clean, bright, and absolute. A vice would loosen somewhere in them, I thought. Perhaps it was a cruelty. Perhaps it was clarity. Either way, the lawyer nodded and began to draft possibilities. We spoke of creating a charitable remainder trust, of leaving specific bequests to the church and to a scholarship in my husband's name. We talked about appointing a neutral executor, someone from the community whom they could not manipulate easily. He suggested with a certain professional caution that I should also review my bank accounts. If you have accounts jointly titled with your son, you should separate them. If he's on the mortgage, as co-signer. Not on the mortgage, I could never. I thought of those early years when I had worked nights to keep a roof over our heads and paid the mortgage ahead every month because bills scared me. I had given Michael the security of a house, and now that house threatened to be the very thing that tore us apart. The meeting ended with a stack of papers and an appointment for the following week. On my way out, Mr. Hargreaves looked at me with something like curiosity and perhaps I fancied respect. "You sound very determined," he said. "I'm old enough to know what I won't tolerate," I replied. Outside, the sleet had softened to mist. I walked slowly back to the bus, the weight of a plan settling onto my shoulders like a shawl. It was a strange comfort, this sense of agency. For years, I had been reactive, a mother putting out fires, a teacher calming scrapped knees. Now I was taking initiative for myself. I felt both guilty and unburdened by that freedom. That evening, Michael called again. He asked if we could meet to patch things up. I told him I was busy. I lied. I was not busy with distractions. I was busy with paperwork, with learning to use sentences like revocable trust without my tongue tripping over them. It felt childish sometimes, learning new words, but it felt necessary. I would not hand over my life to people who thought of me as a bridge to a bank balance. I slept poorly that night. The pages of legal documents fanned across my nightstand like a fan of small, patient birds. But despite the sleep, I woke with a steadiness I had not known since my husband died. The betrayal still stabbed, certainly, but I had begun to transform the pain into work. There is a peculiar solace in focusing your hurt into an action that is both practical and principled. So I began. Small steps first, separate accounts, a meeting with a lawyer, a list of charities that mattered. Each item checked off was a tiny victory. Each victory was sweeter because it had cost me nothing but steadiness and time, two commodities I had in abundance. They had wanted me gone because they equated me with property. I would show them that a life is more than a ledger. And if their greatest wish was for my death to secure them a comfort they did not deserve, then I would quietly, carefully make sure that their wish came to nothing. Resolve can be sharp in the moment, but when the house grows quiet at night, resolve melts into grief. That winter, after the confrontation and the lawyer's appointment, I found myself moving through the days like a shadow of my old self. I would wake before dawn, as I had for years, and sit at the kitchen window with my tea. The snow blanketed the yard, smoothing away imperfections, but all I could see was the roughness of my own. The silence pressed heavy against me. Silence used to be a friend in old age. Now it was a tormentor, echoing Michael's words back to me with every tick of the clock. I had always prided myself on being strong. I buried my husband at 53 and never remarried. I raised a boy into a man alone while juggling two jobs. Strength had been my companion, but now the strength cracked. My son's betrayal was not like death. Death had taken my husband. Yes, but it never took his love. Betrayal was crueler. Betrayal hollowed out the living, left me questioning if all those years of sacrifice had been wasted. I stopped going out as much. At church, I smiled when spoken to, but my voice trembled when I sang hymns. Mrs. Klein, my neighbor, came by twice a week with muffins and polite concern. I lied to her. "I'm fine, just tired. Winter does that to me." But she wasn't fooled. She saw my swollen eyes, the untouched plates in the sink. Nights were the worst. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, hearing Michael's boyish laugh in my memory, a toddler laughing in the bath, a teenager strumming his guitar. That same laugh was now twisted in my head with his cruel words. It was Sometimes I would weep into my pillow until I choked on the sound. At other times I simply lay still, the tears rolling silently into my hairline. The truth is, betrayal doesn't just break your heart. It makes you ashamed. Ashamed of what you gave, ashamed of being fooled, ashamed of loving someone who does not love you back in the same way. I had built my whole life on the idea that family was, and now here I was, a woman nearing 80, wondering if I had failed as a mother, One afternoon in February, I bundled myself in my thick wool coat and walked into town. It was bitter cold, the kind that burns your cheeks. At the bakery, a young woman ahead of me ordered a birthday cake for her child. I overheard her say, "He's turning 8." And something in me snapped. 8. Michael had been 8 when I bought him his first bicycle. I saved for weeks, skipping meals at school so I could afford it. He had hugged me so tightly that day, whispering, "You're the best mom in the world." I left the bakery without buying anything. The memory was too heavy. I walked the long way home, my boots crunching through frozen slush, tears freezing against my scarf. When I got home, I sat in my husband's old armchair and spoke to him as I sometimes did. His photograph was on the mantel, smiling in his navy uniform. "Did I do it wrong, George?" I whispered. "Did I raise him wrong, or did life harden him in ways I couldn't prevent?" Of course, there was no answer, just the hum of the heater and the settling of the house. It was around this time that the dreams began. Vivid, painful dreams. I dreamed of Christmas mornings past when the house rang with laughter, when Michael ran through the halls with wrapping paper trailing behind him. But in the dream, the laughter always warped, twisting into that terrible sentence, "The best Christmas present would be if she finally died." I would wake up gasping, clutching my chest as though the words were knives lodged there. I began to dread sleep. So I wandered the house at night, dusting shelves that did not need dusting, rearranging kitchen drawers, folding the same blankets twice over, anything to keep from lying still and remembering. I think part of me hoped Michael would reach out, truly reach out, not with excuses, but with sincerity. But his calls grew shorter, more strained. Sometimes he didn't call at all. Linda never phoned once. They had chosen their side, and I had chosen my silence. And yet, despite the grief, despite the gnawing ache in my chest, I found myself surviving. Each day I woke and breathed, even if the breaths were shallow. Each day I made tea, even if it grew cold on the counter. The smallest rituals kept me alive when my spirit was cracking. One evening in late February, I was invited to supper at Mrs. Klein's. She insisted I come, and I was too tired to argue. Her home was warm, full of laughter from her grandchildren who were visiting. They ran circles around the table, their giggles bubbling over like champagne. And I wept quietly into my napkin, overwhelmed by the reminder of what joy looked like. Mrs. Klein reached over and squeezed my hand. She didn't ask why I cried. She just held it firm and steady, like an anchor in a storm. That night, as I walked home under the stars, I realized something. Grief had hollowed me out, but in that hollow space, something else might eventually grow. I didn't know what yet. But I knew this much. My suffering would not be the end of me. For now, though, I allowed myself the grief. It was heavy, yes, but it was mine. And in claiming it, I began to sense the faintest thread of strength weaving its way back through me like the first shoots of green pushing through frost. I stayed away from their house after that day, though the memory haunted me like a bad dream that never ends. Still, the silence between us became a heavier punishment than raised voices could ever be. Whenever the phone rang, I prayed it might be David calling to apologize, or perhaps Lily to mend the gaping wound they had left in me. But when I picked up, it was always someone else, the church ladies checking if I would join the bake sale, my neighbor asking if I'd seen her missing cat, a telemarketer droning about health insurance. Never my son. Never my daughter-in-law. At first, I told myself they were busy. Families are like rivers. Sometimes the current drifts apart before coming together again, but weeks turned into months, and I heard nothing. The only glimpse I caught of their lives was through whispers in town. People spoke of David's new job, of Lily's fondness for luxury handbags, of how their little boy was thriving in school. And every time I overheard such things, it was like a dagger twisted in my chest. They were living happily, comfortably, while I was left drowning in the echo of their betrayal. Nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, remembering every moment I had sacrificed for that boy. The nights I stayed up rocking him through his fevers, the mornings I left early to work double shifts just to afford his schooling, the birthday parties where I sat smiling even though I couldn't afford the prettiest cake, all of it apparently forgotten, erased by greed. I found myself questioning everything. Was I truly that unlovable? Had I been blind all these years, mistaking obligation for affection? The questions clawed at me until I grew afraid of my own thoughts. I stopped going to gatherings, stopped baking for church events, stopped sitting with the neighbors on the porch. I became a ghost inside my own home, a home that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a coffin. The worst part was the shame. Oh, how it burned me. To the outside world, David was still the charming boy I'd raised, the successful man who had married a beautiful woman and built a perfect family. No one knew what he had said to me in that kitchen. No one knew that his love had curdled into something cruel and calculating, and I couldn't bring myself to tell them. I was too humiliated. If I admitted it out loud, it would make their words real, carved in stone instead of just bouncing around the fragile hollows of my heart. So I bore it in silence. I smiled when I had to. I nodded when people praised him. And then I came home and wept into the same pillow until it was damp enough to wring out. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I came across one of David's old T-shirts. It was from a summer camp he'd gone to when he was 12. The fabric was faded, the letters peeling, but I held it to my face and inhaled, hoping it would still carry some trace of my little boy's scent. But all I smelled was dust and detergent. And I broke, my knees gave out, and I sank onto the floor, clutching that rag of fabric as if it were him. I sobbed until my chest hurt, until the wall seemed to close in on me. That was the moment I realized the truth. My grief wasn't just about losing his life. It was about losing my purpose. For so long, being David's mother had been my anchor, the reason I woke up every day and kept moving. Now, that identity had been stolen from me, tossed aside like an old coat. And so I shrank. I began eating less, not out of vanity, but because food lost its flavor. I stopped tending to the garden. Weeds overtook the roses I had once pruned, so I avoided mirrors, unwilling to confront the hollow-eyed woman staring back at me. Loneliness can do strange things to a person. Some nights I found myself talking to the shadows in my living room as if they were friends. Other times I would reread old letters from my late husband, clinging to his words like a lifeline. He used to call me his iron lady, the one who never broke under the weight of hardship. But if he could see me now, crumpled on the floor with tears streaking my face, he wouldn't recognize me. And yet, though despair pressed down on me like a lead blanket, there was a tiny flicker inside that refused to die, a whisper that said, "Not yet. Don't give up just yet." I couldn't see what that meant, not then. But something inside me, something buried under decades of struggle and survival, was stirring. It was still faint, like the first crack of dawn on a long winter night, but it was there. And I knew, though I couldn't admit it fully, that I would not spend the rest of my days weeping over the cruelty of others. Somewhere inside me, the iron was still there. It only needed to be found again. That small, stubborn light surprised me by arriving in the least dramatic way, through the post. A thin envelope arrived mid-March, hand-addressed in a looping script I recognized before I opened it. It was from Sister Ann at the parish, inviting me to help with the community soup kitchen on Saturdays. I almost left it on the counter unread. Then something in me, a curious practical part I had long relied on, said, "Go." So I went. The first morning at the kitchen felt like stepping into a different life. The air smelled of simmering onions and tomatoes, and the hum of conversation was steady and unhurried. I stood behind a long table and ladled stew into bowls with deliberate motions that steadied my hands. People came and sat grateful and quiet, and when someone said, "Thank you, Margaret," the word felt like a small, clean stitch in the ragged place inside me. Helping others did not fix it. My nights still felt hollow sometimes, but something subtle changed. When you leave your house to do small work for others, you bring back a different sort of exhaustion. It is the tired that is earned, not the tired that comes from grief alone. And that tired allows sleep to come easier, less haunted. I began to schedule my days again. Monday mornings, I volunteered at the library shelving returned books. Tuesdays, I taught a short reading group for teenagers who needed extra help. Wednesdays, I joined a quilting circle. The routines were simple and practical, but they rebuilt me piece by piece. There is a dignity that comes from being useful in ways that have nothing to do with your family name or bank balance. It was in that dignity that my anger softened from a hot, dangerous thing into something colder and more purposeful. People noticed, neighbors stopped by to chat. Mrs. Klein invited me for tea more often. At church, my pew still held the familiar faces, but now they saw me engaged rather than folded in sorrow. They asked gently about Michael. I offered the truth in measured sentences. "We are not speaking right now." That felt honest enough without being a spectacle. One afternoon, while dusting the books in the genealogy section at the library, I found a title about local philanthropy. It was a thin volume written decades ago, chronicling how families in our town gave back. I read about small trusts that built playgrounds, about scholarships that sent students to college, about endowments that supported the elderly. It gave me an idea that was not cruel and not petty. It was, in its way, generous and final. That night, I took out the legal papers Mr. Hargreaves had left me and read them with new eyes. The lawyer had explained options, and now those words had shape: a charitable remainder trust, a scholarship in George's name, an executor from the parish council. The plans were not about vengeance. They were about ensuring the life I had built benefited more than those who saw me as a stepping stone. I also began to pay more attention to my own health. Grief had made me neglectful. I booked an appointment with Dr. Patel and confessed, as one confesses a sin, how badly I had been sleeping and how little I had been eating. He smiled with the kind eyes of someone who had seen too many human frailties to gasp at the confessions of an old woman. "Start walking," he said. "Sunlight helps, and stop hiding from people who care." It was practical advice, and it saved me from sinking. Walking became a ritual. I would take the long route along the river that cuts through town. The maples were still bare in early spring, but the sharp cold had begun to give way to hints of green. One day I met a young couple pushing a stroller, and we began to. Their names were Claire and Tom. The boy in the stroller had a laugh that reminded me of Michael when he was small. We traded stories about parenting and recipes for quick stews. They asked casually what I had done before retirement. "I taught," I said, "for 40 years. Their faces lit in a way that made me feel useful again. It was in those ordinary conversations that I found new meaning. People looked at me now as a keeper of stories and not merely as an old woman with a house. I began to tell small tales about my students, about the silly mistakes children make when they learn to read. Laughter came easier. For the first time in months, I dreamed of a life that included more than the shadow of Michael's betrayal. Yet, even as I rebuilt myself, I kept one foot in the careful legal plans I had made. Rebuilding did not mean I forgave without consequence. I learned to carry both things at once: a life that welcomed sunlight and friends, and a life that would not be plundered by people who thought love could be traded like currency. At the quilting circle, we stitched squares into blankets that would be given to the winter shelter. One of the women, Ruth, had a keen sense for character. She looked at me over her glasses and said, "You're brighter these days, Margaret. You've got something about you." I laughed, and she squeezed my hand. "Good, keep it." There were small practicalities to attend to, too. I cleaned out drawers and labeled jars in the pantry. I sorted through photographs and found myself smiling at the grainy picture of Michael with his first bike. The pain still existed, but now it was a sharper, clearer memory rather than a jagged, all-consuming thing. I could look at it without falling apart. I never spoke to Michael about the trust or the will. That was deliberate. Secrecy has nothing to do with deceit in this case. It had to do with dignity. If I announced my plans, if I made my decisions the subject of argument, I would have given them ammunition to fight and twist things in court. Quiet decisions are powerful because they leave those who intended wrong with nothing to contest but the truth once it is already said. One evening in May, I was invited to give a short talk at the community center about the importance of intergenerational connection. I hesitated at public speaking. The idea would have terrified me before. Now it felt like a challenge I could accept. I spoke about patience and the peculiar wisdom that comes with age, about listening to children and letting them fail so they people clapped. A few young faces in the audience caught my eye and held it with genuine interest. Afterwards, a student approached me and said, "I wish my grandmother lived closer." The small wish knocked something loose inside me. It was like a promise I had made to myself being answered by an unknown voice. By summer, my roses were pruned back and blooming in a defiant red. I tended them as one tends to a living thing that deserves care. The house felt warmer when I returned from my various tasks around town. The trust I had set in motion with Mr. Hargreaves was still under construction. Papers had been signed, beneficiaries had been chosen. The executor was a steady man from the parish who knew how to divide things with fairness rather than sentimentality. Rebuilding gave me room to breathe. It gave me friends and small duties and the taste of normal conversation again. It also gave me the quiet satisfaction that comes from holding a decision in your own hands. I no longer imagined my life being defined by one son's cruelty. I imagined it defined by the laughter in the soup kitchen and the quilts that would warm. I imagined it defined by a scholarship that would send a child to college in George's name, not because of money, but because of belief. I found joy in ordinary things: bread rising in the oven, the sound of children learning to read, the small curve of a neighbor's smile. I also found strength in the knowledge that I had not been foolish. I had not wasted my years. I had simply been taught that the measure of a life is not in what others will inherit from you, but in what you chose to give while you can. So I kept going, quiet, patient steps forward. The seed that had been planted in the cold of winter was now sprouting, pushing toward a sun I had thought I had no right to see. The roses bloomed red that summer, brighter than they had in years, as if they were mocking the sorrow I had once sunk into. Every morning I trimmed them carefully, a pair of shears in my hands, and I thought about how pruning works. You cut away what no longer serves the plant, and in return it grows stronger, fuller, more alive. That was what I had begun to do with my life, prune. But pruning, I realized, wasn't enough. If I wanted true peace, I needed protection, not just for myself, but for the work of my life, for the home George and I had built brick by brick, and for every dollar I had scraped together over decades of sacrifice. Michael and Lily thought they had already mapped out my end game, me gone, them inheriting, them celebrating their cleverness. What they didn't know was that while they were spending on handbags and vacations, I was quietly turning my grief into strategy. It began with more meetings with Miss Hargreaves. I scheduled them in the mornings when Michael was at work and Lily was busy curating her life for her friends. The lawyer's office smelled of leather and ink, and he always had a fresh stack of papers ready for me. I want it airtight, I told him one. No loopholes. No way for them to claw this back, no matter how they beg or threaten. He adjusted his glasses and nodded. We can establish a charitable trust for the bulk of your estate, the house, the savings, even the little parcels of land your husband invested in. They'll all go into it. You'll retain control while you're alive. After, It goes to the charities, the scholarships, the community fund. And as for Michael and Lily, he paused delicately. They get nothing. They get nothing, I said, my voice flat but steady. They get nothing, he confirmed. I walked out of his office, lighter though the paper folder in my bag was heavy. From there, I began weaving a quiet net around myself. I opened a separate account for my daily needs, one Michael didn't know about. I started donating in small, intentional ways so people saw my name associated not with wealth, but with kindness. If anyone tried to paint me as cold or stingy later, the truth would already be rooted in the community's memory. And then, almost without meaning to, I began rehearsing in my mind the moment they would discover the truth. I pictured Lily's face, that carefully painted smile cracking when the lawyer read out the will. I pictured Michael's silence, heavy and ashamed. It wasn't petty, it was survival. I had lived my life giving them love. Now I owed myself the dignity of control. Still, I was careful not to let bitterness eat me alive. I did not rant about them to my friends. I did not poison my new joys with talk of betrayal. I carried it like a secret stone in my pocket, always there, grounding me, reminding me of the weight of reality. The plotting gave me purpose, but it also gave me clarity. Revenge, I realized, doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be cruel. Sometimes the most poetic revenge is simply to live well, to thrive where others expect you to crumble, and to deny them the fruits of the very tree they once watered with your tears. By autumn, my plans were all but complete. The papers were signed, the funds secure, the trustees chosen. All that was left was to wait. And I am a patient woman. I have lived through wars, through shortages, through raising a son on a teacher's salary with nothing but determination to keep me afloat. Waiting, I knew, was my strength. Still, there was one more layer to my plotting, a final stroke that would make the irony all the richer. I began to prepare a legacy not of money but of stories. I wrote letters, one to my grandson, explaining that my love for him had never wavered, even if his parents had failed me. One to the parish, describing the joy I had found in giving back. And one to myself, a letter I sealed and tucked away in the top drawer of my desk so that when my time came, I would know I had left this world not defeated, but victorious in the quietest, most dignified way. By Christmas that year, I was ready. Not in the sense of confrontation, not in the sense of a battle to be fought in kitchens and living rooms, but in the deeper sense of readiness that comes when you know your life is no longer at the mercy of others' greed. The house was warm with the scent of gingerbread and cinnamon. My tree glowed softly in the corner, its ornaments carrying decades of memories. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, I sat by the fire with a cup of tea, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. They thought they had already won. They had no idea the game had only just begun. The December air was sharp that year, the kind that bites your nose and makes every chimney smoke look like a promise of warmth. My house glowed against the frost, candles in the windows, pine garlands along the banister. I had baked enough to fill the kitchen with sugar and spice, gingerbread men, cranberry loaf, apple pies cooling on the sill. It was the first Christmas since that night in their kitchen, the night I heard my own son wish me dead. Yet here we were, meeting again because I had extended the invitation. I had thought long and hard about it. Should I cut them out entirely? Never see them again? Let the silence itself be my revenge? But no, that would leave too much mystery in the air. I wanted them to see me thriving, smiling, unbroken. I wanted them to look at me across my own table and know, though I would never say it aloud, that their plan had failed. They arrived late, of course. Lily's heels clicked across my porch as she balanced a shiny box wrapped in gold paper, her perfume entering the room before she did. Michael followed, his jaw tight, his eyes not quite meeting mine. Behind them, my grandson scurried in, cheeks red from the cold. Clutching a toy truck, he ran into my arms, and for that moment, the whole world softened. "Grandma," he squealed. I kissed the top of his head, breathing in the innocence of childhood, that sweet scent of peppermint and wool coats. "Merry Christmas, darling." Dinner was a performance. Lily praised the roast chicken, but barely touched her plate. Michael poured himself glass after glass of wine, loosening only when the silence grew unbearable. They asked shallow questions about my health, my volunteering, my roses. I answered politely, every word measured. I was not cruel. I was not even cold. I was simply steady. But as dessert came out, I saw it, the glance they shared. That same conspiratorial flicker I had seen once before. And then, casually, Michael leaned back in his chair and said, "So, Mom, we've been thinking. The house must feel like a lot for you to manage these days." There it was, the beginning of their script. I set down the pie server and folded my hands neatly on the table. "Yes," I said, my voice calm, almost amused. "It is a lot, which is why I've already taken steps to make sure it will be properly cared for after I'm gone." Lily's fork paused halfway to her lips. Michael blinked, his wine glass frozen midair. "Oh," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "That's good. So you've updated your will." I smiled, the kind of smile that knows more than it lets on. "Yes, everything is handled. The house, the savings, all of it. I have nothing to worry about now." The color drained from Lily's face so fast I thought she might faint. She reached for her glass, nearly knocking it over. Michael coughed into his napkin, his composure cracking. "That's responsible of you," he said. His knuckles whitened around the stem of his glass. I looked at them both and then very deliberately turned to my grandson. "And the best part," I said warmly, "is knowing it will go to people who truly need it. To make a difference. Isn't that wonderful?" The boy nodded, too young to understand the weight of my words, but his smile lit the room anyway. Silence fell thick over the table. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. I sipped my tea, savoring the quiet unraveling happening across from me. Lily excused herself to the bathroom. She was gone a long time, and when she returned, her eyes were red. Michael tried to change the subject, sports, the weather, anything to fill the air, but the effort was thin, brittle. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I let the weight of the truth settle on them like snow, soft but relentless. They had wished for my death so they could inherit. Instead, they were sitting at my table, eating my food, knowing that not a penny of it would ever touch their hands. After they left that night, earlier than planned, coats hastily pulled on, excuses muttered, I stood by the window and watched their car lights disappear down the street. For the first time in a long time, I felt no ache, no shame, no desperate longing for their love. Only peace, because I had pruned the rot from my tree. And now, finally, the branches could grow strong again. I breathed freely that winter evening, sitting by the fire and sipping my tea, knowing my heart was no longer chained to their cruelty. I could finally live without carrying the weight of their greed. The roses in the garden bloomed even brighter under the frost, as if celebrating my quiet triumph, and the house smelled of gingerbread and pine, each aroma a small act of reclaiming joy. I did not have to wait long to see the first fruits of my careful planning. Michael and Lily's life, once so secure and gleaming, began to unravel almost immediately. I heard of Michael's business collapsing first, a supplier failing, a loan unpaid, and a series of errors that could only have come from desperation and inexperience. He had been so sure, so arrogant, that my absence would leave him in possession of everything. Yet he had not accounted for diligence, for the careful measures I had put in place, or for the fact that the world has a way of evening the scales. Lily, of course, had her own struggles. Friends began to withdraw their invitations and support when they sensed tension at home. Carefully curated life of comfort and luxury became a cage, isolating her from the very circle she had sought to impress. Even my grandchildren's sweet, innocent souls seemed to pick up on the unease and uncertainty that lingered like a cold draft in their house. Meanwhile, my own life had grown lighter, fuller. I woke each morning to the sunlight streaming across the kitchen, my hands busy with chores that felt like acts of meditation. I planted herbs in neat little rows, painted bird houses to hang along the fence, and baked pies whose warmth filled the house as much as the sense of independence now filling me. I no longer lived in the shadow of their greed. I lived in the glow of my own choices, each decision a quiet reclaiming of power I had once sought lost. Even the neighbors noticed. Mrs. Klein and I spent hours on the porch in the afternoons, laughing over old memories and gossip. At the library, I found myself sought after by young readers for advice and storytelling. At the soup kitchen, I was no longer a volunteer fading into the background. I was a fixture, a mentor, a person whose presence mattered. There was a satisfaction in it, a small, steady joy that their schemes could never touch. By the following spring, I had even begun taking small trips to visit friends in nearby towns. Michael and Lily had assumed I would remain tied to the house, dependent, and they could not have been more wrong. The independence I had cultivated quietly, deliberately, had given me a life rich with connection, laughter, and purpose, a life they would yet the most ironic and poetic part of all this was watching them realize their dependence on me. I did not need to announce it. It happened naturally. By early December, the house had been repaired just as I had planned. Bills had been paid and small investments handled. But Michael had overextended, Lily had mismanaged, and suddenly they were knocking at my door, quietly, carefully, sheepishly, needing what they had once hoped to take from me. I opened the door that first time with a calm smile, my hair brushed back, eyes sparkling with the knowledge of every careful measure I had taken. Michael, Lily, I said, voice steady, how can I help you? Michael shuffled his feet, looking uncomfortably at the floor. Mom, we've run into some trouble, he said. He glanced at Lily, whose face was pale and tight with embarrassment. We were hoping you might help us out for a while. I studied them for a long moment, letting the weight of their words settle. It was astonishing, really, how perfectly life had reversed itself. The arrogance, the greed, the hope that they could capitalize on my absence, all of it came back to them like a boomerang. And yet I did not smile cruelly. I could have. I wanted to, but I did not. I was calm. I was deliberate. Of course, I said finally, we'll work something out. And we did, within the limits I had set, the careful boundaries I had created. Their dependence became temporary, manageable, and completely under my control. I reminded myself that true power lies not in shouting, not in revenge for its own sake, but in the steady exercise of control over what is yours to protect. Over the weeks leading up to Christmas, I watched them fumble and struggle in ways I had once only imagined. Bills came due, debts demanded attention. Their social circles noticed their instability. All the while, I thrived. I hosted a small community gathering, baked cookies with my grandson, and watched my garden flourish. The roses were full and fragrant, and the house rang with laughter and life once more, this time on my terms. I would catch Michael staring at the house from the porch, his expression a mixture of awe and shame. Lily, too, would linger near the kitchen, offering awkward apologies and thin smiles. I accepted neither flattery nor confession outright. They had done enough to prove themselves unworthy, and yet every interaction was a lesson for them. Life does not bend to those who try to take what is not theirs. By the time Christmas arrived, exactly 1 year after the night I had overheard them wishing me dead, everything had changed. They no longer planned for my death, they planned for their own survival. And I, sitting by the fire, with the aroma of fresh pine and cinnamon wrapping around me, felt a peace I had never known before. I thought about the irony as the child they had once raised under their false pretenses now ran gleefully through the halls, laughter pure and untarnished. The adults they had become obsessed with greed and comfort were now quietly learning humility and dependence. And me? I was free, thriving, alive in a way that made every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of grief worth it. Because in the end, life's poetry is found not in vengeance, but in justice, measured and quiet. They had wished for my end, and I had outlived their scheming with joy and integrity intact. The house was mine, the community loved me, my grandson adored me. And for the first time, I knew that Christmas was truly mine to enjoy, not because I had gained wealth, but because I had reclaimed my life. And so I sipped my tea, smiled at the glowing tree, and whispered to myself, "Merry Christmas to me." I sipped my tea that evening, letting the warmth seep into my hands, and watched the snow settle on the rooftops. Life had grown quiet, orderly, and yet rich with a kind of satisfaction that is hard to explain. Michael and Lily had stopped coming by daily. They had learned, as I knew they would, that dependence comes with humility. They had no choice but to ask for help within the limits I set, and even then, only in ways that reminded them of their own folly. It amused me sometimes how life has a way of balancing accounts when we least expect it. Michael, once so proud and certain, had been forced to sell off part of his business to cover debts he had racked up. Lily's social circles had dwindled, leaving her isolated in the very house she had thought would be her inheritance. They had spent a year pretending they could manipulate me, only to find that the one they had underestimated had outlived their schemes and flourished. I, on the other hand, spent my days as I pleased. The garden needed tending, and I found that the roses thrived when my hands were gentle but firm. My grandson learned to ride his bike with me, cheering from the sidelines, and I baked bread and pies for the neighbors, for the church, for the children at the library. Each loaf, each pastry was a reminder that life is sweeter when it is shared, not hoarded. Christmas approached again, and this time I felt no anxiety, no dread. I decorated the house with care, hanging garlands and stringing lights along the porch. My kitchen was alive with the smell of cinnamon and roasting apples. I waited for no one but myself, though I knew deep down that Michael and Lily would appear in some way, as they always did when necessity forced their hand. And they came, of course. I heard the timid knock on the door, the shuffle of footsteps that once rang with entitlement, now tempered by caution. Michael's eyes avoided mine. Lily's lips pressed into a thin line, a gesture that betrayed both embarrassment and resignation. My grandson, however, burst into the house like a sunbeam, his laughter echoing through the halls. Oblivious to the tension his parents carried, I opened the door and greeted them warmly, as I always did. "Merry Christmas," I said, smiling. The words were genuine because I had no need for pretense. I had survived their schemes, rebuilt my life, and discovered that joy is a far greater inheritance than wealth. "Mom, we, Michael began, faltering as he tried to navigate the delicate truth of their situation. "We've had some difficulties. We were hoping—" I raised a hand gently, cutting him off. "I understand," I said, voice calm, almost soft. "I have made arrangements to help you, but within limits. Everything else is yours to manage." Lily's eyes welled with tears, but I did not reach for sympathy. There was no need. Life had taught her humility. Their plight was theirs alone, born from choices they had made. My role was simply to let them experience the consequences. We sat together for dinner, the table filled with warmth and laughter from my grandson, the only sound that truly mattered. Michael and Lily spoke little, their words measured, polite, constrained. And as I listened to their cautious conversation, I felt no anger, only satisfaction, a quiet, deep satisfaction that comes from knowing justice had been served without cruelty, that the balance had been restored. After dessert, I walked to the window and looked out over the snow-covered yard. The lights of the houses across the street flickered in the darkness, distant and cold. My home, in contrast, glowed with warmth, a testament to patience, to resilience, to careful planning. I had survived betrayal, endured heartbreak, and emerged not bitter, but stronger, wiser, and happier than I had ever been. Michael and Lily, for all their scheming, had learned that greed is a poor teacher. They had wished for my demise, only to find that their lives depended upon my generosity and restraint. Their dependence was ironic, yes, but it was also instructive. They would remember it, I knew, and perhaps in time it would teach them humility and care. I, meanwhile, thrived. My grandson's laughter filled the house, neighbors stopped by with warm greetings, and my garden flourished. The community recognized my work and my dedication, the kindness I offered freely without expectation. I had lived a life of love, sacrifice, and resilience, and now I reaped the reward not in wealth, but in peace, respect, and meaning. Later that evening, as I tucked my grandson into bed and watched him drift off to sleep, I felt a deep sense of completeness. Life had been cruel, yes. Greedy people had sought to profit from my love and devotion. But the universe, in its quiet way, had restored the balance. I had survived. I had thrived. And I had taught, without raising a hand in anger, that no scheme built on cruelty could withstand patience, intelligence, and dignity. I returned to the living room and sat by the fire, a cup of tea warming my hands. Outside, the snow fell gently, each flake catching the light from the windows. And I whispered softly to myself, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. Merry Christmas indeed. That Christmas and everyone after, I lived in peace. I lived with the joy of knowing I had reclaimed my life, my home, my dignity. Michael and Lily learned dependence, humility, and restraint. My grandson, thrived under love that was steady and unwavering. And I, Margaret, at 82 years old, felt richer than I had ever imagined possible, not in money, but in freedom, in laughter, and in the quiet, unshakable triumph of having endured, survived, and finally truly lived.